Hello, I'm Perrin Beatty, and welcome to the Business of Business. Throughout the pandemic, we have a series of conversations with Canadian business leaders, government officials, and other experts on the impact of COVID-19 on their communities and how business is responding. My guest today is someone who was described recently in a newspaper article as a force to be reckoned with, and indeed she is. By training, she's a graduate electrical engineer, but she is a member of the Nipissing First Nation, and she is someone who has been very active both as a volunteer, as a business executive, and as a family person as well, who's contributed, I think, about 28 hours each day in terms of the schedule that she keeps. Tabatha Bull became CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business back in the middle of March, just as the COVID pandemic was coming ashore in Canada. Welcome to the Business of Business, Tabatha. You sure have great timing when it comes to taking over an organization.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it was definitely an interesting time to take the helm of the organization, and not something I had, or any of us, I guess, had imagined, for sure.
Now, you had been COO of CCAB prior to taking over, so this is not entirely new to you, and you had been on the board previously.
That's correct. I actually joined the board of CCAB for what ended up being one meeting, and then the opportunity to apply for the COO position came open. And I've always really been in awe of the work that CCAB does, and I find it so inspiring, particularly their work with young entrepreneurs. So I was happy to make the move to more national scale. And of course, with JP Gladue at the helm, he was an incredible mentor and someone I learned so much from. He did depart a little earlier than what I had expected, but it has been a great team at CCAB. So taking over CEO during this pandemic, I would not have been able to do that with the team that we have. They're so supportive and so dedicated to the work that we're doing.
Now, the announcement of your appointment was made on a Friday, and CCAB went on lockdown on the Monday. Have you actually been into the offices yet?
I have not. I've not actually set up a new office, even if I determine to move a new office. No, we actually haven't all sat together since I've taken over this role, besides over our Zoom and GoTo calls.
For those who don't know CCAB, can you describe the organization? What is its membership? What's its mandate? How does it operate?
So CCAB has been an organization around a little over 35 years. It was originally started by a number of different national leaders from corporate Canada, but also national Indigenous leaders. And the mandate of CCAB is to make those connections between Indigenous and non-Indigenous business, but to grow the Indigenous economy across Canada. And over the period of those 35 years, we've definitely moved in the work that we're doing. Some initially, from networking and support and helping businesses grow the network, but now we're really focused on procurement. How do we ensure that we're getting Indigenous businesses into the supply chains of corporate Canada and government? And also, and especially I think important right now in what we're seeing in media and where we are, working on helping corporate Canada understand the best ways to work with Indigenous business and all the different opportunities that they have to grow their networks and to learn from Indigenous business as well. So it is a membership-based organization. We have close to 1,000 members, and about 60% of those are Indigenous business. The remaining are non, and they're from every size and sector, every province and territory across the country.
Sometimes people are surprised to discover the breadth of Indigenous-owned businesses in Canada and the number of startup organizations there are that we're seeing the creation of new businesses in Indigenous communities at a remarkable rate.
Yeah, so currently we're a little over around 56,000 Indigenous businesses in Canada. And our research shows that Indigenous people are creating businesses at 5 times the rate of non. And also looking to export as well. So the propensity to export is also much higher in Indigenous businesses than non-Indigenous business. About 99% of those businesses are small, medium enterprises. So definitely a smaller size business. And, I think we've talked about this before, but Indigenous business, Indigenous peoples were shut out of the economy for so long that we're really starting to close that gap and get back into the economy. But that means we do see that a lot of businesses are younger businesses, so have not been established for, as long as we see in corporate Canada or a non-Indigenous business. And I know we'll talk about this a little later, but definitely those smaller, younger businesses are being more impacted currently. So it's really important that we're doing all the work that we are to support them.
This is certainly something we're seeing across the board, that first of all, SMEs are particularly vulnerable during the pandemic. They don't have the cash reserves that larger companies have, but also newer companies, ones that have founded more recently, are also more vulnerable as well. They're not as well established. And given what you're saying about the startup rate among Indigenous businesses, that means that COVID has hit Indigenous communities particularly hard.
Definitely Indigenous businesses, because we see such a high percentage that are in that small, medium enterprise. And then it really does translate into impact on Indigenous community. Indigenous businesses are more likely to hire Indigenous people. A number of Indigenous businesses are more likely to give back to community in some way, from a percentage of their profits, or is from impact benefit work. So we see that translation and trickle down effect into the community and into the economy as well. And I think also, not unlike any new group of businesses, but they haven't been through a shutdown before. So where some businesses who have been around a longer time have seen differences in their revenue and changes in their revenue. So how do we ensure that we're sustaining these businesses through this time, but then how do we ensure that we have programs in place for them to be part of recovery and to recover? But Indigenous people are resilient and innovative, so I do have a lot of hope that we'll be able to manage through.
Since the pandemic struck, the federal government in particular has announced a wide range of programs designed to support businesses. The wage subsidy program would be an example of that, rental subsidies, a whole range of other programs as well. These have been of general application that any business in Canada potentially could apply. How have these general application programs worked for Indigenous communities? Have they worked equally well, or have there been special problems?
So there have been a few items that definitely haven't quite worked for Indigenous business, and a lot of that has to do with the provisions of the Indian Act and the way that some Indigenous businesses are set up. So because Indigenous business, particularly if they're on reserve, don't have the collateral of the land, because the land is not owned by an Indigenous business, they don't have collateral in going to a traditional financial institution to get a loan or to get a grant. And in the past, unconscious or conscious bias has led to Indigenous businesses being seen as a higher risk rating at a financial institution. We have a number of financial institutions that are members of CCAB, and they are really working, and we've come a great deal, and they've come a great deal in changing those risk ratings and working to ensure that they can be have Indigenous clients. But currently, about a third of Indigenous businesses use a traditional financial institution. So the initial programs that were rolled out through financial institutions didn't really allow accessibility for Indigenous business. We did work with the other national Indigenous economic organizations, such as NACA and CANDO, and there was an announcement in mid-April for additional stimulus of close to $307 million to go out through what are called Aboriginal financial institutions to replace CEBA in a way. So it's a very similar program to CEBA. But it took about until a few weeks ago for that to be finalized and that money to start to flow. So if you look at CFIB's report that says small, medium enterprises cannot manage a shutdown for 30 days, and a number of these businesses had a lag in being able to access that small grant of 40,000 or loan of 40,000 of almost a month in delay. And then the wage subsidy, so Aboriginal economic development institutions, there's over 400 in Canada. They employ more than 15,000 people, many of whom are Indigenous peoples. And they're structured in a way that they have the First Nation as part of a shareholder. And that's again to improve their risk rating with a bank. but the wage subsidy initially was not eligible to businesses that had a government as a shareholder. So those AEDCs were not eligible to apply to the wage subsidy. Some of them had laid off up to 400 people and were waiting for the wage subsidy to be announced. So we did work with a number of our members that are AEDCs, and spoke to Ministry of Finance and a number of other ministries, and they did agree that that was not the intention, but it resulted in about a 3-week delay for AEDCs to be able to apply to the wage subsidy. So, we do commend the government on how quickly they've been rolling out programs, and they have been very responsive when we've noted that there are some issues around being able to apply. But it has resulted in a delay, and in this time when liquidity is such a big concern for businesses, that's put some unique restrictions on Indigenous business and some additional concerns. And we'd really like to see, as recovery programs are put out, that we're really, in all governments and all ministries, are thinking about what are the unique circumstances of Indigenous business on reserve or off, and how do we ensure that all programs are able to support them.
A theme certainly that we were hearing across the board, particularly from SMEs, was that money that arrives too late after a business has been forced to shut down permanently is of no use at all. And from what you're saying, in many instances, Indigenous-owned businesses fell into a crack, and they received funding even after others had, which put added pressure on.
Yeah, exactly. And there's still a number of businesses. There was an announcement last week of $117 million, which is to support micro businesses and businesses that are not incorporated on reserve. And I know that may be a question, but if you're on reserve and are not part of the income tax, if you have all First Nation employees, you're not paying, they're not paying income tax, then you don't have that requirement to be incorporated. So there's a bit of a gap there, and we are happy to hear that there's money coming out. But again, a number of those businesses have seen a bit of a delay for sure.
Tell us about how Indigenous-owned businesses have responded. We've seen many instances where businesses have reinvented themselves, or where they've been forced to change the form of their business or the products that they're operating. How is this applied within Indigenous communities?
So definitely very similarly, we've seen even within our membership. So originally I think one of our first things we did when I became CEO is said, let's look into our membership and see who can provide PPE and get them connected to the federal government's procurement program and provincial government as well. But also for our corporate members who are looking to procure from Indigenous business, let's make sure that we have those connections. And the original list we had of PPE and consulting and businesses that could respond to help fight COVID-19 was probably about 50. Here we are, 12 weeks down the road, and we've seen a number of businesses that in the past were not producing PPE and have been able to pivot. So Ravens Brewery is an example. In BC is an Indigenous-owned business. They're making hand sanitizer. There's another business in New Brunswick, Chief Fuels, who's partnered with a maple syrup company, and they're also providing hand sanitizer. And then we've seen some other businesses who are normally branding businesses, and niche branding is an example. They're now providing masks and hand sanitizer, and they have a really great relationship with BMO, so they're providing a lot of PPE for the Bank of Montreal. And some other businesses who have material businesses who have pivoted to make gowns, medical gowns. So we are seeing a great innovation as amongst Indigenous businesses as well, and so important as well to be able to stay in this economy. And as we move into recovery, we need to make sure that we're making space for all diverse suppliers to be part of that solution.
Well, and what you highlight here is a key point, and that's that as businesses have pivoted and as they've gone into producing PPEs, they're contributing not only to Indigenous communities, but to the broader community as well, as a key supplier of equipment that's very much in demand at the present time.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of businesses Indigenous businesses are saying they want to be able to help support communities as well, of course. And we have seen some really incredible collaborations of Indigenous business and community in order to get PPE to communities. And, we've also seen a number of our corporate members, Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power actually just announced this last week that they're donating significant PPE to a number of communities. So that has been an incredible thing to see. And we've, I've had a number of members call and say, because they're a much larger business, they have large purchasing power. They've been able to secure a good load of PPE, and are there Indigenous businesses who might need that in order to open, and how can we make those connections as well, which is always heartwarming stories to hear during this period.
One of the points that's often missed is the contribution that Indigenous communities make to the broader community. We think often of, when we talk about the role of Indigenous communities in business, about how do we share the benefits in terms of hiring or in terms of procurement and so on from the broader business community. But it's often the case that that Indigenous-owned businesses employ non-Indigenous Canadians, or that they're providing services that are of great interest in the broader community, whether it's from tourism, hotels, a whole range of other areas where everybody has benefited.
Yeah, definitely. And the most recent study, which is now definitely needs to be updated, but said that the Indigenous economy, Indigenous contribution back to the Canadian economy is, close to $30 billion from Indigenous business. But there are a number of communities who have done leakage studies as well to say what's the impact of the buying power of First Nation people within a community in their neighboring city or neighboring town. And the more that we ensure that employment is high, both in those communities, but that those Indigenous businesses, like you said, can thrive and hire from the communities and the towns as well, the more Canada as an economy is going to grow.
Now, often Indigenous communities are in very remote areas where medical supplies are in limited supply, and where hospitals and other medical support is very limited. And as a consequence, many of these communities have put restrictions on travel into the community. How has this affected Indigenous businesses?
Yeah, I think definitely in remote communities, you've seen that they've really closed their borders, and understandably, I think also we saw initially that the cases of COVID were a little bit delayed into communities, and even now the numbers are still pretty good in communities, and that's partially because they've closed their borders. But even in which you wouldn't think of a remote community, but Six Nations, not far outside of Brantford or Hamilton in Ontario, closed their borders on March 23rd. They are forecasting that their businesses will lose about $10 million over the course of COVID. And, they've done that to protect their community and protect their elders, who are so important. And particularly when COVID is so, high elderly people are at such high risk, it's very important that we ensure that we keep our elders here to keep the knowledge and the language and culture. So completely understandable, but it has had a higher impact. I think the other big issue that we're seeing from an impact perspective is infrastructure and broadband. So even initially at the outset, when everybody was saying, stay home and make sure you wash your hands frequently, if you're in a community where you're overhoused and there's 10, 12 people living in a home, and that home doesn't have water, not just drinkable water, but water that you can wash in, you definitely see a higher impact. And those type of, in every crisis, I think when there's a social economic gap, it's accentuated from a crisis. And we saw that initially, but then working from home, where broadband isn't accessible in a community, and that's just not remote communities. Even my own community of Nipissing is about 15 minutes out of North Bay, and I think I was on a call with you and a minister, and I couldn't have my video on, and it's not that far, but for me to be able to work as well as anyone else could and participate as equitably as anyone else could was more difficult. So we're really looking forward to the federal government pushing on the broadband, and we're really pleased to see the province of Ontario provide some funding as well to improve broadband in communities. I think it'll be even more important if we stay in a online school, that the youth and the kids are able to get the same amount of education as you would off community.
Let's pursue that question of digitalization for a minute. And that a theme that has come up often when I've been talking with business people is that well, we had a transition underway before to becoming a more digital society, and where businesses were becoming more digital and offering more digital services and organizing themselves around a digital backbone increasingly. The effect of COVID-19 has been to accelerate that. And we've seen new products and new systems of organization. But again, I think you highlight one of the challenges for Indigenous communities that given their remoteness, in many instances, digitalization is not an option for them.
Yeah, definitely, and definitely puts them a little bit behind, for sure. And we saw that prior to COVID as well, with some businesses and some of our members that are on reserve but have an online store, that they had difficulty being able to ensure that they could get product and that they could get orders in with their own internet. But we are definitely seeing as well a number of members, and even, you know, Indigenous businesses that aren't members, but that would normally sell their goods at large conferences or at powwows and celebrations. And with those large gatherings not happening, they've really had to be sure that they could pivot to some type of e-commerce platform. And we've been really working to support that, but that's definitely a need for us to ensure that we can help those businesses be able to pivot to an e-commerce. Even myself, I wasn't really an online shopper prior to COVID, and I'm getting definitely more comfortable with the idea and, you know, the ease and simplicity. I think we won't see people really go back to shopping in stores quite to the extent that they were in the past.
It is certainly a permanent change in behavior that we're seeing, and most of the businesses that I've talked to have said a number of the changes that we've adopted during the pandemic, we're not going back to the way it was before. We're only moving forward. But this really accentuates, if we're talking about a gulf in terms of opportunity between Indigenous communities and Indigenous businesses and the rest of society, it really highlights the importance of rolling out that digital spine throughout rural and remote areas of Canada to enable people to be able to participate fully.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, definitely. And like I said, you know, education as well is going to be so important if we go to remote learning. I mean, even I live in Toronto here, and you know, there's 4 of us online every day, and I've had to upgrade my own service, but that was an easy phone call to my provider for them to quickly do it overnight. And so important for people to be able to be in their community as well. You know, we'd hate to have to move those businesses off community or people out of the community so that they could access broadband. So we are really hoping that budget will continue, but be accelerated if possible.
Let's talk for a minute to go back to the question of decontrol. How do we move from lockdown to a more open society and more ordinary lives? You mentioned the fact that within many First Nations communities, there were travel restrictions that were put in place, and that's had an impact, obviously, on businesses. Do you see a different pace of reopening within Indigenous communities? Are there special challenges posed by reopening? What do you see as the likely rollout of decontrol within Indigenous communities?
I think I haven't spoken too much to community leaders. I know in my own community, we were a little bit more closed, but outside North Bay has been actually pretty good at the number of cases. Has been pretty small for sure, even within North Bay. So I think the one difference is that communities have their own control about reopening. It's not up to the province or the federal government about closure and reopening. And we have seen, I have seen just in following some of my friends and cousins in their communities, that communities are starting to reopen. I think for a number of communities, especially if you're more remote without access to health care, access to PPE will be an issue for some of those communities. And also, you know, just ensuring that we're protecting, particularly, you know, I just read today that there was a number of cases in a remote community, and those people need to be flown out of those communities to get to where healthcare is. So I think it's understandable that they're going to be protecting. I mean, on the other side, you hear from some businesses that really want to start to have their community reopen so that they can be part of the economy again. And I think those leaders have a really difficult decision for sure.
We talk often about the so-called new normal, and what I have said to people is we won't even know what the new normal looks like until we have a vaccine and wide distribution and can resume much more of our normal lives. But you've no doubt been looking at what are the trends that will be affecting Indigenous communities and particularly Indigenous businesses. Do you have a sense as to how the environment will be different, say 2 years from now, as opposed to a year ago for Indigenous communities?
Yeah, I think it's something that we're really thinking about at CCAB. A big part of our programming and revenue comes from our large gala events. We have 3 of them a year. And we're not certain that those are going to happen again and in the next year or 2. So how are we going to pivot away from that large event if we need to? And also just to make sure that everybody feels safe in order to attend an event like that. So how do we ensure that we're creating the networks and creating those spaces for connection and allowing for these small businesses to be able to grow their network outside of that typical type of large gathering? So we're actually moving what would have been our Vancouver event to a virtual conference forum September 16th. So it will be a bit of a test run to see how that goes. I think in some ways, though, it's going to provide a lot more access and ability for the small business to participate in some type of event. It'll be a lot less cost. You won't have the travel cost as well. So I think that's part of where we're thinking in our own strategy. And then also, how do we help businesses reopen and recover in whatever the new normal is? So from what type of funding is required for businesses to be able to pivot, to have PPE for their staff, to put in plastic shields, and where are we looking at recovery in that time frame? And that frame of mind as well is something that we're trying to speak to program developers and communities and businesses about.
That brings me to my final question, and that's that you took over CCAB at possibly the most difficult time that you possibly could have, but you bring to it a sense of optimism and enthusiasm that is infectious in a good way. Looking down the road at the future of Indigenous business, are you an optimist? How do you see this evolving? Where do we go from here?
I am definitely an optimist. I think that the growth that we've seen, and actually through this period, as difficult as it's been, both the resilience from Indigenous business and the innovation that they're looking at, but also the incredible way to support one another. I'm part of this group of women, which I actually feel bad I don't have enough time to give as I would like, but it's called an Indigenous Lift Collective, and it's a group of women entrepreneurs who are there to help each other. And how do we help one another? And I've seen these incredible women. Someone needs a laptop and the other one has an extra laptop and ships it across the country. It's just their generosity in order to help each other and not compete against each other. I think that gives me a huge sense of optimism. I think also we've actually seen a lot of corporate members come on board during this period. Corporate members who are really saying, how can we help? What's our part in economic reconciliation? What more can we be doing? So that's also provided a good sense of optimism. And as I said, the team that we have and the network that we have, I'm so grateful to you and Goldie Hyder for really including me initially as soon as you heard that I took over this role. And that has been a huge support and learning for me, for sure. So I think you've seen Canadians really come together, and that gives me a huge sense of optimism.
Well, Tabatha, thank you very much for being with us today. It's great to have you as a colleague in the business association world and as an executive in the business world. And thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you. Have a great day.